You can solve an equation that contains a perfect square by finding the square roots. The simplest of this type has the form of ax squared is equal to c. So for example, if you have 4x squared plus 10 equals 46, we want to solve that for x by moving that 10 to the other side, subtracting 10 from each side. We want to get x by itself. And then divide each side by 4 to get x squared is equal to 9. Now you need to take into account all the possible values for x here. So to get x by itself, take the square root of each side. The square root of x squared is x. But on the other side, you want to take into account the positive and also the negative square root of 9. Because x really could be 3 or negative 3. If you square 3, that's 9. And also if you square a negative 3, that's 9 as well. So those are the x-intercepts, 3 and negative 3. When I graph this equation, 4x squared plus 10 equals 46, you can see it crosses the x-axis at 3 and also at negative 3. Those are the x-intercepts. And the y-intercept would be the constant term when it's in standard form. Subtract 46 from each side. The y-intercept would be negative 36. Standard form is where you have everything to one side equal to 0. So the x-intercepts are 3 and negative 3, and the y-intercept you can see is negative 36. You have 3x squared minus 5 equals 25. Going to solve that for x. To solve that for x, move that 5 to the right side by adding 5 to both sides. When you do that, you get 3x squared equals 30. Then divide each side by 3. X squared would equal 10. Now again, we need to take in all the accounts that x could be. So if you take the square root of each side, x could be the square root of 10 or the negative square root of 10. Because if you square the square root of 10, that is 10. And if you square the negative of the square root of 10, that is going to be 10 as well. So x could be positive or negative of the square root of 10. Now in decimal form, that would be 3.16 or negative 3.16. So depending on the directions, you may have to go to radical form or decimal form. But those are the x-intercepts. This graph crosses the x-axis at 3.16 and also negative 3.16. If you have 7x squared minus 10 equals 25, to solve that for x, you want to add 10 to both sides to get the x by itself. Get 7x squared equals 35. Then divide each side by 7 to get x squared equals 5, and then take the square root of each side. X would equal the positive or the negative square root of 5. So again, take into account all the possible values for x. It could be the square root of 5 or the negative of the square root of 5. Because if you square the square root of 5, it's 5. And if you square the negative of the square root of 5, that is 5 as well. So x equals the square root of 5 and also the negative square root of 5 in decimal form would be 2.24 and also negative 2.24. Those are the x-intercepts. It would cross the x-axis. A little zoomed out there, but it would cross the x-axis at 2.24 and negative 2.24. Also, the y-intercept is the constant term when it's in standard form. So to get that in standard form, subtract 25 from each side, you'd have 7x squared minus 35 equals 0. That negative 35 is the constant term in standard form, and that is the y-intercept, negative 35. While designing a house, an architect used windows like the ones shown. What are the dimensions of the window if it has 2,766 square inches of glass? So you can see that x equals the width, and 2x would equal the length, or the height. The area of a rectangle is length times width. We could say width times height, base times height, doesn't matter what words you use. So the area of that rectangle would be x times 2x, and that is 2,766. So 2x squared would equal 2,766. To solve that for x, if we find the width, then we can find the length as well. To solve that for x, divide each side by 2, get x squared equals 1,383. And then take the square root of each side. If you take the square root of 1,383, that is positive or negative 37.19. But the width of that window cannot be negative. X can't be negative, so throw the negative idea out. X just equals 37.19. So the width is 37.19, then the length, or the height, you could say, is 2x. Multiply that 37.19 by 2, and that is 74.38. So the width and the length, or the height, you could say, width is 37.19, and the height or the length is 74.38. If a semicircle arch of glass was wanted for the top of the window, so sometimes you drive by a house and you see a semicircle arch of glass over the top of the window. That's what we're talking about here. What would be the area of that piece of glass approximately? Well, to get the area of a circle, you take pi r squared. We're talking about a semicircle here. So the area of a semicircle would be pi r squared divided by 2. It's just half of a circle. So the radius, imagine an arc going over the top of that window. The radius of that semicircle would be half of what x is. So you'd say it's 3.14 times 18.6 squared over 2. Pi r squared. R is the radius. The radius is half of what we had for x back here. We had x is 37.19. The radius is half that. That is 18.6. So pi r squared divided by 2 is 3.14 times 18.6 squared divided by 2. If you square that 18.6, it's 345.96. Then just multiply 3.14 by 345.96. It's 1086.31 divided by 2. That is 543.16 square inches. So again, what would the area of that piece of glass be? That semicircle arch over the top of that window? It's 543.16 square inches, approximately. Sometimes an equation shows a perfect square trinomial equal to a constant term. To solve that, factor the perfect square trinomial into the square of a binomial and then find the square roots. For example, if you have x squared plus 4x plus 4, that is a perfect square trinomial. 3 terms, it's a trinomial. You have perfect squares on the ends, and then in the form of a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. That factors into the form of a plus b squared. So if a squared is x squared, then a, the first term of that binomial, is x. And if b squared is 4, b, the second term of the binomial, is 2. So we're just taking the square root of x squared, that's x. The square root of 4 is 2. That's if it's a perfect square trinomial. Or you could just factor it the old way, where you think the first terms of the 2 binomials that you'd factor that into make that x squared, so to be x and x. And the second terms, multiply to make 4 and add to make 4, it's going to be 2 and 2, which is the same as x plus 2 squared. So either way you factor it, you end up in the same place. X plus 2 squared equals 25. Now to solve that for x, you need to get that exponent off of that. So take the square root of each side. The square root of x plus 2 squared, that would be x plus 2. And on the other side, square root of 25, that could be a positive square root of 25 or negative square root of 25. Well, the square root of 25 is 5, so x plus 2 would equal positive or negative 5. And then subtract 2 from each side, get x equals negative 2 plus or minus 5. So we're going to have 2 solutions here. X equals negative 2 plus 5, also x equals negative 2 minus 5. So if you take negative 2 plus 5, that is 3, and negative 2 minus 5 would be negative 7. So x would equal 3 or negative 7. Those are the x-intercepts. So if you graph this equation, x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 25, or even f of x equals x squared plus 4x minus 21, if you get that in standard form or function notation, it's going to be, the x-intercepts are going to be 3 and also negative 7. So where it crosses the x-axis, it hits the y-axis at negative 21. That is the y-intercept. If you subtract 25 from each side, that gets that into standard form. So x squared plus 4x minus 21, negative 21 is the constant term, and that is the y-intercept. So the x-intercepts are 3 and negative 7. The y-intercept is negative 21. And also the parabola opens upward because your x squared is positive. What is the solution of x squared minus 14x plus 49 equals 25? Well, on the left side, we have a perfect square trinomial. That is the square of a binomial. So that perfect square trinomial will factor into the square of a binomial, and that binomial is x minus 7 squared. So once again, the form for a perfect square trinomial could be a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. If a squared is x squared, then a, this first term of this binomial, is x. This factors into the form of a minus b squared. If b squared is 49, b, the second term of the binomial, would be the square root of 49, and that is 7. And since it's in the form of a squared minus 2ab plus b squared, put a minus sign in between those terms. Or you can factor it the old way. Just factor this into 2 binomials. The first terms of those 2 binomials would be x, since you have an x squared out front. The second terms of those 2 binomials, multiply to make 49 and add to make negative 14. That'd be negative 7 and negative 7. So you'd have x minus 7 times x minus 7, or as you see up there, x minus 7 squared. So it doesn't matter how you factor it, whether you think of factoring a perfect square trinomial or factoring it the old way, you're still going to end up with x minus 7 squared. That equals 25. Now take the square root of each side. So the square root of x minus 7 squared, that would be x minus 7. And on the right, the square root of 25 would be the positive or the negative square root of 25. Well, square root of 25 is 5. So you have x minus 7 equals positive or negative 5. Add 7 to both sides. Get x equals 7 plus or minus 5. So you have 2 solutions. 7 plus 5 and then 7 minus 5. If you take 7 plus 5, it's 12, and 7 minus 5 would be 2. So those are the x-intercepts. That graph crosses the x-axis at 7 and also at 2. The y-intercept is the constant term when it's in standard form. So to get this in standard form, you'd subtract 25 from each side. You'd have x squared minus 14x plus 24. 24 is the y-intercept. So the y-intercept is 24. The x-intercepts, as you see back here when we solve this for x, the x-intercepts are 12 and 2. And also the parabola opens upward because the coefficient of x squared is positive. We're going to solve 25x squared plus 10x plus 1 equals 9. Now you might think, is that a perfect square trinomial on the left side? Is that in the form of a squared plus 2ab plus b squared? Well, to check it, it's real simple. If a squared, that first term is 25x squared, then a, the square root of that, would be 5x. So just remember a is 5x. And if b squared, this 1, if b squared is 1, b would be the square root of 1, and that is 1. So a is 5x, the square root of 25x squared, it's 5x. b is 1, the square root of 1 is 1. Then in the middle, this has to be in the form of 2ab. So 2 times 5x times 1, that is 10x. So that is a perfect square trinomial on the left side. It's in the form of a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, and it simply factors into a plus b squared. So take your a, which is 5x, your b, which is 1. 5x plus 1 squared is what that factors into. Now you could factor that by grouping, and you're still going to get the same thing. You're going to get 5x plus 1 times 5x plus 1, or 5x plus 1 squared. So to solve that for x, we need to get rid of the parentheses, take the square root of each side. The square root of 5x plus 1 squared, remember square root and squaring, those are inverses of each other. They knock each other out. So it'd be 5x plus 1 equals, on the other side, it's square root of 9. You have to take into account the positive and also the negative square root of 9. So 5x plus 1 equals the positive or negative square root of 9. Positive square root of 9 would be 3. The negative square root of 9 would be negative 3. Subtract 1 from each side to get 5x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus 3. So we're going to have two solutions. We're going to have negative 1 plus 3 over 5, and also negative 1 minus 3 over 5. So if you take negative 1 plus 3, that's 2 over 5, and negative 1 minus 3, that would be negative 4 over 5. Those are the x-intercepts. So if you graph this equation, it would hit the x-axis at 2/5 and negative 4/5. Or if you get that equation in standard form, it's going to be y, or f of x, equals 25x squared plus 10x minus 8. Or you might have 25x squared plus 10x minus 8 equals 0. Standard forms where everything's to one side equal to 0, or equal to f of x, or equal to y. In this case, it's showing f of x equals 25x squared plus 10x minus 8. Well, in standard form, you can see the y-intercept. Where it hits the y-axis, the value of x would be 0. So if you put zeros in for those x's, y, or f of x, would be negative 8. So the y-intercept is the constant term when it's in standard form. It's negative 8. You can see that's true. It hits the y-axis at negative 8. And also it hits the x-axis at 2/5 and negative 4/5. So the x-intercepts, when you solve for x, you get 2/5 and negative 4/5. The y-intercept is the constant term when it's in standard form. In this case, it's negative 8. And the parabola opens upward because the coefficient of x squared is positive. So all of those things you can see. If you solve for x, you're finding the x-intercepts. The constant term, when it's in standard form, the constant term, that is the y-intercept. And also, the parabola opens up if the coefficient of x squared is positive. It would open down if the coefficient of x squared is negative.